My parents accused me of stealing, kicked me out, and now they want me back. You ever have one of those moments where your whole world shatters in an instant? 1 second, you're just living your life, thinking everything is fine, and the next, you're staring at the wreckage of everything you thought was real. Yeah, that was me. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but after everything that's happened, I need to get it off my chest. My name's Daniel. I'm 27 now, but this mess started when I was 24. I come from one of those families that look perfect from the outside. You know the type. Big house, expensive cars, charity events, and Christmas cards where everyone wears matching outfits like a damn magazine spread. But behind closed doors, it was different. My dad, Patrick, was a powerful businessman, the kind of guy people either feared or admired. My mom, Cynthia, was the picture-perfect socialite, always throwing parties and smiling for the cameras. And then there was my sister, Leah, 3 years younger, beautiful, brilliant, and absolutely untouchable. Leah wasn't just a favorite. She was the golden child, the one my parents put on a pedestal so high, she could do no wrong. And me? I was just there. Don't get me wrong. I wasn't a screw-up. I had a good job in cybersecurity, kept to myself, and didn't cause problems. But compared to Leah, I might as well have been invisible. She was the one my parents invested in, the one they were proud of, and I was the one they tolerated. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need their validation. But deep down, I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt. The only person who ever made me feel like I actually mattered was my best friend, Nate. We'd been inseparable since middle school. While Leah had her rich, preppy friends, Nate and I were the ones tinkering with computers, fixing up old cars, and finding ways to make money that didn't involve kissing anyone's ass. My parents didn't like him. He didn't come from money. His family was average. And in my parents' world, average meant not worth their time. But I didn't care. Nate was like a brother to me, the kind of person who had my back no matter what. I just didn't realize how badly I would need him, because in one night, my entire life was about to come crashing down. It was a Friday night, one of those evenings where I just wanted to be anywhere but home. My mom was throwing one of her fancy cocktail parties, the kind where she invited other rich couples to brag about how wonderful their lives were. I usually avoided these things, but I made the mistake of stopping by to grab something from my room. Big mistake. Because the second I walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. The entire house was silent. Not the usual kind of silence. Not the quiet of a party winding down. This was the unnatural kind. The kind where people had just stopped talking because of you. I barely had time to process it before my dad stormed into the hallway, his face red with rage. "You ungrateful little bastard," he spat, shoving a piece of paper into my chest. I looked down. It was a bank statement, a list of withdrawals, thousands of dollars gone little by little, and every single one was under my name. I stared at the bank statement in my hands, my brain trying to piece together what I was looking at. Thousands of dollars gone, withdrawn in steady increments over the course of months. The transactions were all under my name, tied directly to my account. My father stood in front of me, livid, demanding to know how I could do this to my own family. My mother, arms crossed, looked at me with a look of pure disappointment, like I was some lost cause they had finally given up on. Leah lingered nearby, her arms folded, watching everything unfold with a careful, almost expectant expression. I barely got a word in before my father accused me of lying, telling me they had checked everything. My name was on every transfer, and all the withdrawals happened near a casino. My mother cut in coldly, making sure to emphasize exactly which one. The same place where Nate worked. That, to them, was all the proof they needed. In their eyes, I had been running some kind of scam, using my supposed expertise in cybersecurity to siphon money from them while Nate handled the laundering. It was absurd. I tried to explain. I told them I had nothing to do with it, that someone must have hacked into my account, stolen my identity. My father dismissed it immediately. If anyone should have been able to protect against something like that, it was me. If I was dumb enough to get scammed, then that was my problem. But he didn't believe that was the case. He believed I had done this deliberately, that I had gambled away their money and was now scrambling for excuses. My mother's disappointment cut even deeper than his fury. She demanded to know where the money had gone if I wasn't the one who took it. Leah barely even pretended to be surprised. She made a few passing comments about consequences, her tone almost bored, like she had expected this from me all along. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about money. This was about how easily they could throw me away. The conversation turned into a blur of accusations, disbelief, and rising anger. I argued. I begged them to check the security footage at the bank, to look at actual proof before making up their minds. But it didn't matter. The decision had already been made. My father told me I was no longer welcome here, that he had given me every opportunity, and this was how I repaid him. I turned to my mother, hoping, praying for some hesitation, some doubt, but she wouldn't even look at me. My father had already packed a bag for me, tossed together in a way that made it clear I was no longer part of this house. Leah watched the whole thing with a slight smirk, her amusement barely hidden. She made some offhand remarks about how actions have consequences, but I barely heard it. I asked where I was supposed to go. My father said it wasn't his problem. I stood there for a few more seconds, waiting, hoping. But my mother turned away, my father crossed his arms, and Leah just watched, drinking in every second of it. I picked up the bag and left without another word. Nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The night air hit me like a slap. I had no plan, no idea where I was heading. My car was parked down the street, but it didn't matter. I had nowhere to drive to. I checked my bank account, hoping I at least had something left to get me through the next few days. It was empty. They had cut me off completely. I did the only thing I could think of. I called Nate. No answer. I tried again, and again. Eventually, a single text came through. Short, distant. A simple, sorry man, I can't talk. That was all I needed to see. They had gotten to him, too. I didn't know how. Maybe they threatened him, or maybe they convinced him I was guilty just like they had convinced themselves. Either way, it didn't matter. I was completely alone. 3 years later, starting over was hell. I had nothing, no support, no one to call. But I clawed my way back, city by city, job by job, until I built something of my own. A business, a reputation, a life free from the people who had tossed me aside. And then, 3 years later, my phone rang. I almost ignored it, but then I saw the name on the screen. Mom, a name I hadn't seen in years. A name I never expected to see again. It was a normal evening, well, as normal as my life had become since I cut ties with my family. My apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing by outside. I had just settled into my couch, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when my screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in years. Mom. I stared at it, the name feeling like a foreign language. My first instinct was to let it ring out, let the past stay where it belonged, buried. But something in me, some deep-rooted instinct, made me swipe to answer. Her voice came hesitantly, almost trembling, as if she didn't know whether I'd even listen. There was a tightness to it, like she had been crying. She said my name, as if testing whether I'd hang up on her right then and there. I stayed silent. Then, the words I never expected. We owe you an apology. I almost laughed. The absurdity of it. After all these years, after they had tossed me aside without a second thought, now they had regrets? Now they owed me something? She went on, her voice unsteady, and I could tell she was struggling to find the right words. She said they had made a terrible mistake, that they had been wrong about everything. My stomach tightened. There was more to this. Then she said it. You were framed. Everything in me froze. She rushed to explain. It wasn't me who had stolen from the family. It was Robert, the employee my father had trusted for years, the one who had practically been treated like a second son, had been the one behind it all. He had manipulated the financial records, fabricated evidence, and covered his tracks well. Too well. The moment the accusations had been raised, my father had assumed it was me. There had been no investigation, no second thoughts. Just blind trust in Robert and blind disbelief in me. I couldn't move. My mind spiraled back to that night. The night my life changed forever. I had been dragged into my father's office, blindsided by his accusations, not even given a moment to defend myself. My protests had meant nothing. The anger in his eyes had been absolute. And now, they had realized the truth? I barely heard the rest of what she said. Something about how Robert had gotten sloppy, how missing money had finally pointed back to him, how they had confronted him and gotten the confession they should have demanded from the start. The betrayal hit me all over again, just as fresh as the night I was thrown out. They had wanted to believe I was guilty. That was the real truth. If they had taken even a second to consider otherwise, they would have found out I was innocent. I could hear my mother crying now. She was saying something about regret, about how my father was devastated. That word, devastated, made my hands clench into fists. He had been so sure of himself back then. So sure that I was nothing but a disappointment. So sure that I was the problem. And now, after destroying my life, he felt devastated? Then she finally admitted it. They wanted me to come home. My heart pounded in my chest. The sheer audacity of it. They had kicked me out like I was garbage, let me fend for myself when I was barely more than a teenager. Let me suffer alone without so much as a second thought. And now, after they had burned that bridge to ash, they wanted me back? I felt something inside me crack. Not anger. No, I had been angry for too long. This was something colder. Something final. I let out a long breath, steadying myself. I told her I needed time to think. She sounded relieved, like she had expected worse. I wished I had. I ended the call, but I didn't move. The phone sat in my hand, heavy as a brick. The past I had spent years trying to outrun had just caught up to me in a single night. And now I had a choice to make. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The past I had buried. The anger, the betrayal, the nights I spent alone with no one to turn to, had been ripped open like a wound that had never truly healed. For years, I had built a life without them. I had learned to be independent, to thrive despite what they had done. Now, out of nowhere, they wanted back in. And the worst part? I could feel a part of me considering it. I hated that. I hated that, after everything, some small, broken part of me still wanted to believe in them. That maybe, just maybe, if they were truly sorry, things could be different. But I wasn't that naive kid anymore. I knew better. The next morning, I stared at my phone for an hour before I finally responded to my mother's message. Fine. One meeting. That was it. One conversation to hear them out. Not because they deserved it, but because I needed to hear the words from my father's own mouth. I needed to see if he had actually changed. I met them at a quiet diner on the edge of town. The kind of place where no one knew my name, where I could walk in and be a stranger. They were already there when I arrived. My mother looked nervous, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, gripping it like it was the only thing keeping her together. My father, for the first time in my life, looked small. This was a man who had always carried himself with a kind of unshakable confidence. The kind of man who never admitted fault, never backed down, never wavered. But now, he looked like someone who had aged 10 years in the time I had been gone. His hair was grayer, his posture less rigid. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. Good. I sat down across from them, folding my arms. I didn't say a word. I wanted them to speak first. It was my mother who broke the silence. She started with the same thing she had said on the phone. How they had been wrong, how they had failed me, how they should have listened. She talked about how my father had refused to believe Robert could betray him, how that blind trust had led them to make the worst mistake of their lives. I waited for my father to say something, anything, but he didn't. So I turned to him and asked, point blank, if he had really thought I was capable of stealing from him. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, finally, he spoke. He told me that, back then, it had been easier to believe I was the problem. That it had been easier to see me as the disappointment rather than to question the people he had built his life around. Hearing it out loud should have made me feel vindicated. It should have made me feel like I had won, like my pain had finally been acknowledged. But all it did was make me feel empty. Because deep down, I had already known the truth. My mother kept talking, kept trying to explain, but I barely heard her. My mind was stuck on that single realization. They had never truly loved me. Not in the way a parent is supposed to love their child. Not in a way that meant I was irreplaceable. I had been disposable to them. And now that they had learned the truth, now that they had lost me, they wanted to undo it all. They wanted me to just come back as if none of it had ever happened. Like the years I spent struggling, building myself up from nothing, didn't matter. I let them talk. I let them spill every apology, every excuse, every regret. And when they were finished, I took a slow breath, met my father's gaze, and asked the only question that mattered. If Robert hadn't gotten caught, would you have ever reached out to me? Silence. My father looked down. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. That was my answer. I leaned back, nodding to myself. They weren't here because they loved me. They were here because they were ashamed, because they had realized too late that they had thrown away their son for nothing. And now, they had to live with it. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. My mother begged me to just think about it, to give them another chance, to let them try to fix things. I told her I'd think about it, but we both knew that was a lie. The messages didn't stop. After that meeting at the diner, I had expected them to get the message, to see the look on my face, to hear the finality in my voice, and understand that there was no fixing this. But they didn't. If anything, they became more persistent. At first, it was my mother. Soft apologies, gentle pleas. She tried to remind me of the good moments, what few there were, telling me that we were still a family, that we could move forward and rebuild from this. I ignored her texts. I let her voicemails pile up, unread, unheard. Then came my father. His messages were different, more formal, less emotional. He didn't beg. He made offers. We can't change the past, but we can make the future better. I want to do right by you. I have a position for you at the company, a high-ranking one. You'll have everything you ever wanted: security, success, family. Family. Funny how he suddenly remembered that word. I read the message and tossed my phone onto the table, staring at it like it was a venomous snake. A job? A high-ranking position? As if money or status could erase the years of silence. As if success would somehow make up for the fact that I had to scrape and claw for every single thing I had. It was insulting, because the real message behind it wasn't, "I'm sorry." It wasn't, "We love you, and we want you back." It was control. It was him dangling something in front of me and expecting me to bite, because in his mind, that was all I had ever wanted, wasn't it? His approval. I didn't respond. A few days later, another text came. This time, it was different. "Daniel, please come to the house. We need to talk." I shouldn't have gone. I knew I shouldn't have gone. But some part of me, the part that had been raised to obey, to seek approval, to hope, still wanted to hear what he had to say. Pulling into the driveway of my childhood home felt like stepping into a graveyard. Everything looked the same, but it felt hollow. The front door was already open when I walked up, and my mother was there, smiling like nothing had ever gone wrong. Like this was just another visit. She reached out, hesitated, then pulled me into a hug. I let it happen, but I didn't return it. Inside, my father was waiting. His expression was unreadable, serious, expectant, like he was about to seal a business deal. The dining table was set, just like it had been when I was a kid. I could almost hear my mother's voice, scolding me to sit up straight, to stop fidgeting, to be better. I didn't sit. "You got my message," my father said finally, gesturing toward the chair across from him. I remained standing. I did. A pause. Then, he sighed and leaned forward, folding his hands together like he was deliberating something important. "I know we failed you," he admitted, and for the first time, his voice had weight to it. Real regret. I should have seen the truth. I should have defended you. I made the biggest mistake of my life when I let you go. I waited. And now, he continued, I want to make things right. Then he slid a folder across the table. I glanced at it but didn't touch it. "What's this?" He exhaled, as if tired of explaining. "An official contract. A full-time executive position. Salary beyond what you'd make anywhere else. The company will be yours to run, one day." There it was again. The offer. The bribe. I let out a slow, deliberate breath. "You still don't get it, do you?" My mother looked between us, nervous. "Sweetheart, please. This is a chance for a fresh start." "A fresh start?" I interrupted, letting out a dry laugh. "You think this is about money? About status?" My father's expression darkened. "I built my own life," I told him, my voice steady. "Without you. Without your company. Without your name. Without a damn thing from you. You don't have to struggle anymore," my mother whispered. I turned to her. I stopped struggling the day I left this house. Silence. My father's face hardened. He wasn't used to being refused, to being powerless. "You're being stubborn," he said, voice colder now. "You're letting pride get in the way of your future." I laughed again, a bitter, tired laugh. "No, you're just realizing you have no power over me anymore." His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. I looked between them. My mother, teary-eyed, pleading. My father, stiff and angry, as if he had expected me to fall in line the moment he extended his hand. This was never about love. It was never about making things right. They just couldn't stand the fact that I had proven them wrong. I took the folder, flipped it open, glanced at the papers inside, then tore them in half. My mother gasped. My father's face went red. I let the shredded contract fall onto the table and stepped back. "This isn't a second chance," I said quietly. "This is just another test, and I'm done proving myself to you." I turned and walked out. I expected my father to shout. I expected him to demand that I come back, to order me to sit down like I was still some desperate kid seeking his approval. But he didn't, because he knew. He had already lost me. That night, the messages came one last time. First from my mother, desperate, apologetic, begging me to reconsider, to understand that they were trying, that they loved me. Then from my father, cold, short, final. "You're making a mistake." I didn't respond. I blocked their numbers. I deleted every old message, every voicemail, every trace of them from my life. And then I sat in silence, waiting for sadness, for regret, for anything. I had spent years wondering what it would feel like to hear my father say he was wrong. I thought it would bring me closure, that it would heal something inside me. But the truth was, closure didn't come from them. It came from walking away. And this time, I wasn't looking back.